muted. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Military History Logistics Series hosted by the Royal Canadian Logistics Service Association. My name is Peter Boyle, and I'm going to be the host for this evening. Our intention is to run 3 of these professional development sessions per year, once around Remembrance Day, once today on the logistics birthday, and another one in April, when we'll talk about the April speaker at the end of the evening. A few housekeeping notes. Please remain muted throughout the presentation. I would ask that you put any questions in the chat so I can sort of assemble them, and then I'll ask Andy at the end. But we will have an opportunity for a live Q&A. We will have time for a live Q&A if you've got questions. Sorry, again, I'll just ask everyone to remain muted unless you're asking a question near the end. The session is being recorded, and it's going to be hosted on the RCLSA YouTube channel in the future, and we'll send that link out to everybody who attended. If you are having any technical issues, please send an email to the same address that you registered under, and I will try to assist you offline to get things going. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the president of the Royal Canadian Logistics Service Association, John Page, to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome, Andy. We really appreciate you staying up this late to share your words of wisdom with fellow logisticians from over the seas. Happy 54th birthday. The Royal Canadian Logistics Service is one of those amazing things that can provide and project support to the Canadian military anywhere in the world. And that's what we do, and we do it very well. And we're all very proud of you and what you do. Part of the association's mandate is to provide history and heritage services for the service. And these are some of our opportunities to do it, particularly in this time of COVID-19. So thank you all for coming out. I see that this is the 3rd one that we've run since Remembrance Day, and the participation keeps going up, so it's really nice to see. So thank you all for coming. It is my grand pleasure to introduce to you Major General Rick Goodyear, the Senior Serving Logistician, who is joining us here tonight for some words of wisdom and birthday wishes. General?
Thanks, John. I'm going to try my video, see if it works. Just give me a sec here. Beaming in from at home. Video working?
Yes, sir, it is.
All good. Okay, listen, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here today on this auspicious occasion, 1st of February, marking our birthday. Just to reiterate some of John's comments, of course, it's apropos to say a big thank you to those that are serving and those that have served in the past. What we do every day is what enables the operations of the Canadian Armed Forces. And none so more important than these days with what's going on all around the world. And as you can see, what's going on in Europe right now, certainly interesting times as we posture to try and help our friends in Eastern Europe. Undoubtedly, logisticians will play a key role in all that plays out in that part of the world. Certainly an occasion to celebrate, but I also wanted to note today some of our past logisticians, as I noted to, I think I mentioned to some colleagues today, a long-serving logistician, Lieutenant Colonel McCabe, Malcolm McCabe, if you knew him, passed recently. So just condolences to him and to his family. And if you knew him, he was a wealth of knowledge and certainly a pillar of our community. So condolences to all that would have known Malcolm. A tragic passing recently. And of course, his son continues to serve, Lieutenant Colonel Adam McCabe, part of the RCLS now. John and team, I want to thank you for putting this on. This is, by virtue of all the numbers, it's obvious that you're generating lots of interest. I think this is fantastic. This is a great service that the that your organization is providing to all of us. And I very much look forward to the briefing, and thank you to the briefer for taking time out of what is now, I guess, well past the hour of midnight to regale us with your presentation. So without further ado, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good.
Perfect. I'll just do a quick introduction of you, Andy, and then we'll get started. So Andy Robertshaw is a British military historian and TV personality. He's made a number of television appearances, including 2 Men in a Trench and Time Team, which some of you might know. He's a battlefield archaeologist who has done considerable work on the Western Front, and particularly the fighting on the Somme battlefields. And he's been a historical advisor to many well-known movies, including They Shall Not Grow Old and more recently 1917. Andy works extensively with the British Army and has led battlefield studies all across the world for different militaries, including a few times for us Canadians. As mentioned, it is after midnight, and I do thank Andy for staying up to give us this talk. He is the former curator of the Royal Logistics Corps Museum, and it will be this expertise that he's going to speak on Commonwealth and Canadian logistics during the Second World War. So Andy, without further ado, I'm going to make you the host so that you can share your screen, and we'll get on our way.
Sure. Okay. I'm just going to have to just do something else. Can you see that screen now or not?
I can't. Oh. No, I can't. Give me 1 second here. I think I have to just change something on my.
Can you change that? Is that okay?
Yep. Okay. You want to try and share again?
Okay. Okay. So I'm the host now. 2 seconds. This is not working out very well. Okay. God, 2 seconds. Bear with me. Good. Are we? Hang on. Okay. Right. Okay. How's that? Okay.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, fine. Are we okay now?
Yep, we're good. Off you go.
Lovely. Okay. Sorry about that. That was a slight mistake. For those people who are in the know, and I suspect a few people out there, Happy New Year, as well as happy birthday. As you already know, my name is Andrew Robertshaw, and I was previously director of the RCLSA Museum in Deep Cut, and this is one of our open days, which is luckily for me Second World War themed, as you can tell, complete with the ice cream van, which isn't. My interest in military history has always been the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day life of soldiers. I'm interested historically and today with soldiers who sort of eat, sleep, drink, and frankly, go to the washroom as much as I am with anything else. And in fact, I was somewhat beaten to this by this. This is General Sir Archibald Wavell, The Real Foundations of Military Knowledge, Topography, Movement and Supply, not Strategy and Tactics, as most people think. Generals and Generalship, 1939, and how wise he was, because he knew about the sinews of war. So let's go back to the beginning of the Second World War, perhaps not worrying too much about what might happen in Ukraine right now, but in many ways there are similarities. On the outbreak of war in 1939, September the 3rd, the British Army, the BEF, it was then known, begins to mobilize. And when it mobilizes in the traditional way. Essentially, the Royal Navy exists, as far as I'm concerned, as far as the Army is concerned, as a means of getting the Army to where it's required. And as you will be well aware, if anything goes wrong, to recover it. So whether that is Corunna in the Peninsular War, or it is Norway in 1940, or frankly, Dunkirk, that's what the Navy does. It is worth saying that actually in 1941, when the Royal Navy was tasked with recovering the army from Crete, they were asked how many ships they would lose. The answer was about 22 to 25 ships. And they said, you know, was that a problem? And the answer was, it takes 300 years to make a reputation. If we don't do that job, recovering the troops from Crete, we've lost our reputation. So it's mobilized in the usual way. We come in through the major ports, and then what we do is we establish this logistical network. Now, one problem is that we're aware that actually there is a major issue with potential for enemy bombing. And that potential is that the ports we'd used previously, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, the ones we'd used in the Great War, would be extremely vulnerable to bombing. So the decision is taken to move everything off to the west, taking it outside the range of enemy bombing from Germany. So we can see here, we're using Saint-Nazaire, Brest, Saint-Malo, Cherbourg, Dieppe. We're way off to the west. And in fact, curiously, if we look on that logistical network, you'll see that Caen features, obviously somewhere that will reappear in 1944. But you can imagine that everything then is off to the west, but our main focus is the border with Belgium, because just like the First World War, we've gone to war with the intention of helping a plucky little Belgium. And the British Army is basically for the winter of 1939 to the spring of 1940 on the Belgian border. It's actually in France. It doesn't enter Belgium because any movement into Belgium might be regarded by the Nazis as being provocative. Does that sound at all familiar with what's happening right now? So we sit on what's called the Dial line. General Dial is commanding the British Army, and we dig in and we wait. What then happens is that actually we end up with a situation where the army is completely mechanized, the most mechanized army we've ever had. We almost have no horses. In fact, compared to any other army in Europe at the time, we have actually a massive preponderance of armored and motor vehicles. But in other ways, if you looked at it from the point of view of 1914 to 1918, it looks very, very familiar. Permanent camps, large ammunition dumps, exactly the same as there would have been in Hulter's Forest in the First World War, waiting for what would be what we could call a conventional war. At this point, we regard it as being Sitzkrieg rather than blitzkrieg, and the whole period is called the phony war. But what it demonstrates is that, at least the point of view of the BEF, we have really little understanding about what will happen next, because what happens next is Plan Yellow. And this is one of my two slides which shows the campaign in the West, and it actually begins with the outbreak of an offensive war by the Nazis. By the way, I'm going to call them the Nazis rather than the Germans, on the basis that there are Dutch, Belgian, Latvian, Estonian Nazis who aren't necessarily German. So please bear with me. It begins with a thrust not directly against where the BEF is in Belgium, but we use that as a trigger to move from our fixed defences into Belgium, and they're very pleased to see us. But as you can imagine, this creates a few problems. And the big problem is illustrated by that large bulge, which is in the area around Sedan. Having crossed the Meuse, the German, or should I say again, Nazi forces keep moving, particularly the forces under Rommel, who we'll obviously know later on, by the way, who is no great logistician. And what happens is, this is what happens. Eventually, they meet the sea. They actually come as far as the Channel. And actually, what they do at that point is they cut off the BEF. Now, I don't care about the fighting capacity of the average territorial or regular soldier of the British Army in 1940. But at the point that they actually reach the sea, well, frankly, the Nazi forces mean that there is no more fuel coming. There is no more ammunition. There's no more mail. there's no more rations. And although the French army generously give the British army rations, there is no commonality in anything. Ammunition doesn't match, nothing really works. And of course, they also cut off the Belgian army and the remains of the French army, which is the French First Army, which is completely isolated. And what begins next is that great retreat back to the coast. Absolutely no choice at this point. There is a question asked, is it possible to move logistics further here to the east? Could we start resupplying through Boulogne and Calais and Dunkirk? The answer is it is too late, too late. And what happens then is the mass destruction of vehicles, and then we are then down to the speed of, well, here, the retreat. Although the guy on the left looks quite cheerful with his large loaf of bread, actually they're retreating using the only means available, in this case, a wheelbarrow. It's all over. And then we retreat back to Dunkirk, and we all know what happens after that. I mean, the retreat to victory, yeah, the only good thing for the British Army is that we need to resupply everything larger than a steel helmet and a rifle from scratch, because it's all been lost. So basically 1940, which we see really as being about blitzkrieg and the offensive tactics being so effective in destroying the army, is only really effective because they cut our logistical tail and means that we have no choice but to retreat. There is nowhere to go at that point. But then what happens? Well, the Nazis turn east. They then face the Russians. And at that point, we have a change. And that change is the development of the Atlantic Wall. And this is a low-flying Spitfire reconnaissance aircraft photographing defensive obstacles on a beach on, in this case, the Western Front. And that Atlantic Wall will run from Scandinavia right down to the Spanish border. And if you can just forgive me for a moment, a few years ago now, in 2014, I went to give lectures on a cruise. The cruise was through the Baltic. We went right up to St. Petersburg, and then there was a train visit to Moscow. And while I was near Moscow, my guide, I wasn't guiding, I was a tourist, said to me, because they knew our historian, what's this? And they pointed at a Nazi tank wrapped in barbed wire, a monument. And I said, sorry, why are you asking me? He said, well, this is where we stopped you. Sorry, what do you mean? Well, from here we can see the Kremlin, but you Westerners, this is where we stopped you. Makes you think, doesn't it? And of course, this makes you think, because the idea was for the Nazis, the Atlantic Wall would allow them to fight the Soviet Union while they were then able to then turn back on the West. And bear in mind that in the Great War, that's exactly the same as the Germans managed to fight their war, fighting both ways, both east and west. But this photograph here demonstrates that the Atlantic Wall was a crust, nothing more. If it was pierced, then things would change. And as you all know, on the 5th of June, 1944, it was planned that we would launch Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Europe. And the plan was to invade through what was relatively thin defended area, which is actually Normandy, avoiding Pas-de-Calais, avoiding the fixed defenses of the 15th Army, because that was the area where the Nazis thought we would invade. And it is worth saying at this point that their planning had allowed for an invasion of Britain via Kent and Sussex, actually coming through where I am now. I would have been an objective of D+3 or 4 in their invasion. And because they planned it that way, they assumed we would plan exactly the same thing in reverse. So just one thing to bear in mind is that if you have a plan and then you think about, we flip it, don't always assume the enemy will mirror what you're doing. Instead, we went to Normandy. And it's worth saying again that actually that's where Duke William the Conqueror, launched his invasion of Britain in 1066. So it's always worth bearing in mind the lessons of history rather than what's staring you in the face, the here and now. And the key thing about D-Day is, of course, that it's launched on June the 6th, one day late because of bad weather. And anybody that studies the Normandy campaign is obviously going to be obsessed by the events of the morning of the 6th of June with gold, sword, and of course, Juno. But the key thing about that is that although that's critical to the actual invasion, what follows is a loss of life, which is around 7,000 soldiers. There's a lot of people. It's exactly the same in percentage, by the way, as the 1st of July 1916, 11%, but rather more successful. Why is it more successful? Well, because although we have a heavy loss of life, we're actually able then to establish the Mulberry Harbours. And the key thing about this is that early in the war, an engineer had approached Winston Churchill and described how it might be possible to build a floating harbour that could be shipped out to a possible invasion port. We could therefore avoid trying to capture a major port like Calais, Boulogne, Cherbourg, or Dieppe, or dare I mention any of the others, on the basis that they would be heavily defended, because the Nazis realized the importance of logistics following an invasion. But if we take a harbour with us, each, by the way, equipped with an anti-aircraft gun, as you can see here, we could develop a system as we see here. Now, the Americans get theirs. Theirs is called Mulberry A. We get ours, which is B for British. And as you can see, there's an outer breakwater. There's an inner series of floating roadways, and it allows us then to supply our invasion force. One of the things that generally confuses American historians is the delay between our landing and then the breakouts. Now, it has to be said that General Montgomery said that breakout phase would follow within about 90 days of the invasion. We had to establish our lodgement area before a breakout could occur, because simply the Nazis would have pinched it off, as they had done elsewhere in Italy, at Anzio and elsewhere. And the rhinos here are part of our floating bridgeway here, a class 24 bridge, taking vehicles up to 24 tons. And that allows ships to disgorge onto lorries or vehicles to be brought over the bridgeway, and then a similar system used for evacuation of wounded and return of other supplies. It is, however, worth saying that actually Eisenhower said one of the mainstays of victory in the Second World War was not the fighting strength of the American soldier or even the British or Canadian. It was as follows. It was the Jeep, and here the DUKW, the Duck, the amphibious vehicle, a 2-ton vehicle able to transit, as we can see here, unloading inside the actual protected breakwater directly into the vehicle, and then going inland without having to disgorge. Now that means actually that we can then take our supplies inland. And key to all of this was this. This is often known as Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. It actually is called HACE. It's a multi-pipe system, initially running from the area around Sandown on the Isle of Wight, straight across to the continent, allowing the supply of fuel to be taken, on the basis that one of the most vulnerable elements of any invasion fleet would be tankers or any form of bulk carriers. We'll come back to that in a minute, but the key point is that at no point in the campaign was all of the vulnerable fuel, which would have been at the time petrol, gas rather than diesel, vulnerable to air attack. However, we have to bear in mind that within a few weeks of the invasion, there was a massive storm. It completely wrecked the American system, and they in the end simply abandoned it. And the British system was badly damaged around Arromanches, but remained operational and would still be in use right to the end of the war in Europe, right through to the spring of 1945. Now, when we now come to a very controversial element to all of this, and that element is here, we have a DUKW, a dock. Actually, this one here contains the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, but in the background, we have a number of ships that have been allowed to dry out. In other words, the tide's gone out and they've simply been allowed to sit on their keels on the bottom. The Americans had always said that actually the building of the Mulberries would be an obstacle, not an opportunity. And their argument was not that American pluck and kind of vigor would get us through it, whatever happens. Rather, their view was actually it was a massive amount of engineering, a massive amount of concrete, a massive amount of effort for no purpose, because this would work perfectly well. Twice a day, the tide comes in and the tide goes out, and twice a day, vessels like this, not the biggest ones, and that's an issue, but the other ones could be allowed to dry out and they could discharge directly onto the beach. Particularly, of course, if you do have a fleet of DUKWs, which allow you to transit from the side of the ship, whether it's floating or not, onto the beach and then inland from there. And bear in mind that with that 1 ton payload, that's a lot of equipment, fuel, ammunition, rations that the army would actually need. What then happens is the armies begin to break out, and they break out in a series of thrusts. The first of which is by the Americans, is into the Comtam Peninsula, and here we actually have the port of Cherbourg, and the amazingly, it still survives to this day, large port which is used for transatlantic shipping. But on the right-hand side, you see what the Nazis have done. They have done a very good example of port denial. We actually have a ship overturned directly in the entrance to the basin, which would allow small ships to dock. And what the Nazis do is that throughout Europe, they carry out massive port denial. One feature of the entire campaign, which might surprise you, is that places like Lorient and then Dunkirk, both of which would have been useful. Dunkirk, particularly useful to ourselves, the British and the Canadians. Lorient of use to the Americans because they always planned to use it way off in the West. They simply were not taken. They surrender on the same day as Berlin. In other words, the garrisons of those places are able to prevent the use of the ports right to the end of the war. And by the way, even if they had been taken by assault from land and sea, then port denial would have meant it would take months for them to come back into anything like a useful status. So we need to bear in mind the Nazis, having retreated up through Italy, up into mainland France, are well aware of how they can influence the outcome of the campaign using simple knowledge of logistics. This, by the way, shows the same view from the land. And then the big build-up begins, the big build-up in the area which we now would regard as being the lodgement area. And here we're using roller racking to move equipment around. And then we then get this, and that is the use of basically air supremacy over Normandy. Now, we're not talking about something that's temporary, we're talking about something that's permanent. The Nazis are fighting a war on two fronts. In the east, they are struggling against the Soviet onslaught. The Luftwaffe is short of fuel, short of aircraft, and pretty short of pilots, to be perfectly honest. And here we see the crew of a Firefly, standard 17-pounder tank on a Sherman, looking skywards and being fairly relaxed. A view not shared here by soldiers of 12th SS Panzer, Hitlerjugend, which you will be familiar with following the massacre of the Abbaye d'Ardennes. There, they're looking a little more sanguine because they realize what this means. And one of the things that's been carried on throughout the campaign is a systematic destruction of means of fuel production within Europe, but also with the means of shipping fuel. And it has to be said that in one of the most remarkable stories, I think, of the entire Normandy campaign, Eisenhower approached both President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill and said it would be necessary prior to the invasion to cripple the French railway network. When asked what that would mean in terms of civilian casualties, he said something like 40,000 French civilians would die. Roosevelt and Churchill said, no, there is no way that you can kill that many French civilians. He said, in that case, I resign. It's as simple as that. He was told he could go ahead, but the casualties would be basically his responsibility. The campaign went ahead. The French railway network, also that of Belgium, also that of the Netherlands, also that of any other country where we might invade, was crippled. Now, bear in mind that the reason for doing that was so we didn't indicate to the enemy where the invasion was come. We couldn't just cripple the railway network of Normandy because that would be a complete giveaway. However, one of the strange effects of this is that actually the system of construction, which actually is established by the Nazis, is very, very capable of building beach defenses. It's capable of building tunnels and bunkers. It's also capable of building new railways. So what then happens is, throughout the spring of 1944, as soon as the Americans in daylight or the British or Canadians at night destroy railway networks, destroy railway bridges, then all that happens is the Nazis use their combination of troops and forced labor to repair the railways. Actually, it doesn't cripple the French railways in the way that we'd imagine. What it does, however, is it stops the Nazis from building the Atlantic Wall more effectively than otherwise would have been possible. They stopped laying mines, they stopped building bunkers, they stopped building new gun positions. So although on the one hand, the intention of the bombing campaign is to cripple the railway network, which fails, it actually cripples the Nazis' ability to construct at speed the crust of defenses, the Atlantic Wall, they would need in the event of an invasion. And you all know exactly what happens. Frankly, D-Day is no pushover, but just think how much worse it would have been had the troops not been employed in repairing railways, rather than laying the millions of mines that were still in their crates when we land on the 6th of June. And then we get this. We get a situation where actually we're able to then begin the breakout. The operation that we now know as the Falaise Pocket requires basically destruction of the army within Normandy. But this is the key to it. not the number of dead soldiers, not the number of dead tanks. What it means here is that with complete air supremacy, every single supply vehicle, every single vehicle carrying fuel is destroyed. And you'll be well aware, one of the victims of this air campaign, whether, by the way, the pilot is South African or Canadian, doesn't matter. The fact is, it's also able to take out of the campaign Rommel, who we'd met previously. He returns to Germany, where ultimately he commits suicide. Now, one thing to bear in mind is when you visit, and hopefully you will post-COVID, Northwest Europe, the destruction is absolutely appalling. This is the city of Car. Car is 85% destroyed in the campaign. Saint-Lô, something like 90% destroyed in the campaign. But ultimately, the Nazis make a big mistake. And their big mistake is to make a thrust intended to cut off the Americans from the Brits and the Canadians. And they do that with a thrust to the west, which fails. The result of that is they then begin to retreat, and then the Americans, Canadians, Poles, and the British are able to surround them, the Falaise pocket. They then begin their withdrawal back to, frankly, the Dutch-Belgian border, the Great Swan, as it's called. And by the way, swanning about in the desert is what was capable of being done in an area with few physical features, no rivers. You could swan about and do a great deal of damage behind the enemy's front line. The Great Swan takes us here over the River Rhine using one of the engineering miracles of the Second World War, the Bailey Bridge, and then moving off. And during this phase of the campaign, the great enemy, frankly, is dust. But the other enemy is this. Although this Sherman tank on its way north is looking pretty good, there's a problem. Every single inch those tracks move take it further and further away from the lodgement area and from the Mulberry Harbours. Think about that. What it means is we then begin this great breakout. During, by the way, the campaign, there is no coincidence for you that both Boulogne and Calais will be taken from the landward side by Canadian forces. But we end up in that campaign actually going in a few weeks from Normandy right up to the Dutch-Belgian border. The 11th Armoured Division, for example, is able to get as far up to Antwerp. We capture the base of the River Scheldt. But please look at that. Look at Flushing, Walcheren, South Beveland. The Scheldt is critical to supply. And however, when you look up the coast, when you look at Dieppe, the port captured but ruined. Boulogne captured but ruined. Calais captured but ruined. Dunkirk holds out. It doesn't surrender. Off to the west, Lorient, Brest holding out. We now have made a problem which we had not ever envisaged. And that problem is, can we supply all of those forces now facing east based on supply purely from the area where we first landed? Now, at this point, we start using HACE, Pluto, pipeline of the ocean. We build a new link, which brings actually from Kent, where I'm talking to you now, to the coast at Calais, and we start pumping fuel. Now, the fuel was originally designed to be actually in a subterranean system, basically underwater. It works really well that way. Why? Because when you put pressure of fuel into the pipes, you've actually got an external pressure from the sea. When we try extending it inland, it doesn't work. Why? Because there's no external pressure other than air. air is not as heavy as water, and the pipes simply burst. And then we're in a situation where, and I spoke to General Churcher, who was in command of 151st Infantry Division during the Normandy campaign. And at the time they got to Antwerp, he said to basically his commander, Royal Army Service Corps, what was he short of? And he was told he was short of track, he was short of spares, and he was short of fuel. And actually the general, bless him, led a convoy of vehicles from Antwerp all the way back to Normandy, where at, and he admitted it, gunpoint, requisitioned what was required. He then drove back, arrived in triumph and went, "Ha, I'm here." And his chief logistician said, "That's very nice. Can you do that every day?" And that's one reason why, by the way, General Patton's army off to the west was stopped. At that point, we had no ability to supply the army. We'd assumed that we would capture from the landward side, port after port, and then we could begin to supply. We'd actually have basically logistics on the shoulder of the advance. That simply does not happen. And worse still, when we take Antwerp, nobody gives the order to capture both banks of the Scheldt, which is why later on, Canadian forces find themselves fighting their way up to Walcheren, while the commandos fight their way back towards them to try and free up the River Scheldt, as we'll see in a few moments. Now, this, by the way, just to give you an idea what this means, if you ever find yourselves having a beer or perhaps some French fries and mussels in Calais, that is what Calais looks like after liberation. So with some older French people that you meet, they may not always greet you in quite the way that you imagine, because they remember the destruction that accompanied liberation, and that's quite important. So now we start that great move inland. We begin moving inland. However, there's a problem. The problem is we simply do not have enough fuel, food, ammunition, supply both the Americans and the Canadians and the Brits and the Poles and the Free French in a move on the entire front. So the plan is basically created to actually break out of the bridgehead we've established on the Belgian-Dutch border by putting all our resources into a single thrust that would be 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne, and 1st Airborne, basically getting across the Maas, the Waal, and then the Rhine. If that had been effective, if that had succeeded, we would have got into Germany. We would have bypassed the Hindenburg line, and frankly, we, and not the Soviet Union, would have been the first into Berlin. As it was, you can see it's a risky operation. And when we talk about the airborne carpet, at least one participant said, will the carpet be alive or dead? And what we get then is the use of airborne resources. Now, why is that critical to my story about logistics? Well, the answer is really quite simple. These aircraft that we see here rely upon refueling. They rely upon links back to airfields in England, where I am now. They're not requiring any of their elements to come via Normandy. None of that ammunition, none of those soldiers, none of that fuel is actually coming via Normandy up the over 200-mile route that would take them up to Holland. Instead, they are being supplied directly. By the way, it is worth saying that this is an example of death by 1,000 cuts. 101st Airborne get 100% of their resources supplied on day one. They are successful. 82nd Airborne get on day one 70% of their resources supplied on day one. They are relatively successful. 1st Airborne which is meant then to be the very end of the thrust, is then told they will get 30% of what they needed on day one and the remainder over the next 4 days. Well, anybody who knows anything about Operation Market Garden, which looks very effective, will know that it actually is not as effective as we would have liked. So this is a situation then by the winter of 1944. We're now in a situation where key to resupply of everything that's going on is now routes. There we have it. We've got an idea that from Le Havre and Rouen is 250 miles in anywhere in an area up to Antwerp directly from the area of Le Havre. From the area then from Le Havre onwards out towards the German border at Trier, it's some 500 miles. But key to supply at this point is, yes, still Normandy, which is struggling, but absolutely key is now Antwerp. The Scheldt estuary has been cleared, it's been demined, and now we find ourselves in a situation where Antwerp becomes key. And this actually shows Antwerp as it was in 1944 into 1945. And what might surprise anybody who knows anything about the Blitz is that although the second Blitz, the V1s and the V2s, are initially directed at London, it's actually this most important area for the most important area for hits taken by V1s and V2s. This is Antwerp. It takes more hits than London and all of the UK. This is just one incident of a V1 hit actually on Antwerp. Why? Because by this stage in the war, using mobile launching systems, both for the V1 and for the V2s, the Nazis realized that London is no longer the main objective. There is no point hitting Southampton or hitting any of the UK ports. What matters now is Antwerp. If they can cripple Antwerp, then the campaign is over. And if you ever wonder what the objective was of the operation, which we now know as the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes, it is to get to Antwerp. Because if Antwerp falls in Christmas 1944, then frankly, the campaign in the West is over. Now, you all know that doesn't actually work. And what we get ultimately is this as our means of destruction of the Nazi forces. We ultimately get as far as the base of Denmark, we get up to the Baltic, and of course, we move off to the east into the heart of the Reich. But the key point then is, of course, that actually Churchill is able to visit Berlin, but only as a guest of the Soviet Union, the Russians. The key thing about everything that we've learned here is that had we had possibly a bit more luck, or perhaps better planning, perhaps a worse opponent, bearing in mind those ports that surrender only when the war is over, only when Berlin is captured. And here is a chair being sat on from the Reich Chancellery. Then we would have had a different post-war world. Then we would have had a world in which it wasn't the Soviet Union that captures Berlin, when it would have been the Western Allies instead. Now, on the 6th of June 1944, Stalin was informed that actually the Allies had landed in Normandy. What he said was, and I won't use the profanity, he said, about F time. You can work out what that meant. When Zhukov got to Berlin, he was put through by telephone to Stalin. And he was able to say, Comrade Stalin, your forces, careful not to say his, because that would have been the gulag for him, have captured Berlin. Stalin said, the forces of Tsar Alexander captured Paris. What's your point? And he put the phone down. Now, I'm a historian. I'm not a correspondent for modern press. But when I talk to you now about what Stalin said, about what actually happens in 1944 and 45, and when I talk to you with the backdrop we have with what's happening in Ukraine, then it really makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think. And the key point must be, is that the key to understanding military history are the sinews of war. They're not the ones that people look at. And very importantly, having worked on films variously, of various types, they're not the ones we see on the big screen. Why not? Because it's boring, it's mundane, it's ordinary. And as somebody once said, nobody worries about basically toilet roll in a campaign until it's not there. Then they're well aware that something has gone horribly wrong. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Andy, thank you very much for that presentation. I think that gives us a wonderful perspective of the logistical challenges of the push east. I have a couple questions in the chat, and if anyone has additional ones, please add them in. The first one, sorry, just bear with me here. So you spoke about the mulberries and how the American ones were damaged, with the ones at Armage were not as heavily damaged. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you anyways. Was there a reason that the American ones took that extra damage versus the British ones?
Basically, it was more exposed to a storm from the Atlantic, and also the bottom wasn't as stable. If anybody who's been to Armage now, most of that mulberry survives because it's on rock. The American harbour was very largely on sand, and frankly, there were no ways of anchoring it. So it was almost completely destroyed. Anything that was left over was given to the Brits. We used it. But the Americans regarded it, and I perhaps didn't make it very clear enough, as a bottleneck. I mean, Dr. Benamou, a French dentist, an expert, frankly, on logistics, basically written a book that says that the Mulberry Harbours actually impeded unloading rather than actually allowing it. It got in the way. It didn't actually help. The American system of allowing ships to dry out was more efficient. And they'd always said it. But frankly, I have to say, I do not see Churchill, Eisenhower, or Roosevelt allowing the campaign to go ahead on a kind of it'll be okay kind of basis. So we over-engineered it.
Okay, excellent. Next question. Could you maybe give us just an idea of scale, or and I'm not sure if you have the exact numbers at your fingertips, but if you're looking at an Allied division, whether American, British, Canadian, how many tons of supplies, like fuel and food, are we talking about? Just to try and put that in perspective of our lift we have today.
I can't. I wish I did. It's gone out of my head entirely. I mean, we're talking about an Allied force of something like initially 500,000 men, each requiring, I don't know, about half a ton of supplies, fuel, water per day. So just allow for that and you won't be far out. But I can't hand on heart say that I know that, but there are some very, very good books on it. Von Crefeld being one, there are many others. But no, I have to say on one occasion, on this occasion, I can't remember.
No problem. I suspect with the mechanization of forces actually being quite similar to what we have today, it probably hasn't changed a ton. Next question, can you maybe comment on I don't know if this is your expertise, but what was the Soviets' ability to move fuel? How did they had great distances to bring that in?
Okay, the Soviets basically had a couple of advantages over us. One of which they used diesel. Is that familiar? They did not use petroleum, which meant that actually that they were using the same fuel that powered tractors during the 5-year plans, and they simply shipped it using trucks. And they used the good old jerry can. Now, the jerry can is somewhat misunderstood. We first encountered them in the Western Desert. The British Army at the time was using what were called flimsies. They were exactly that. 50% of fuel was lost, whereas the jerry can is very robust. It has 3 handles, so that when they're empty, you can hold the middle handle. When they're full, 2 people can hold the handles on both sides. Would you believe they have a bustle on the top, wait for it, so that if you drop a full jerry can into water, it still floats. It's a remarkable bit of kit, it really is. And basically, we copied them, the Americans copied them, the Soviets copied them. They simply use it on that system. And they don't go massively over sophisticated. And I would say that following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a story where members of NASA meet members of the Russian space race, and the guys from NASA described, using a remarkable pen that will work in any conditions will require in 0 gravity. And a Russian guy goes, "That's great. How much that cost?" And they went, "I don't know, about $10 million." He went, "Well, what do you use?" And he just produced a pencil. And that's exactly what the Russians do. They just keep it simple.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry, there's just a question came in here. I'll ask this one first. What books would you recommend to logistics personnel who want to know more about Second World War logistics?
Okay, I would say 8 Million Tons to Victory, which is Dr. Benemu's book, and then I would also recommend von Crayfield's book. I don't have to spell that. I should have it in front of me. I suspect you're about to get this, yeah, and wave it around. You're better than I am, yeah. Have you got it? Yeah. I
don't actually have that one. There's another one that's quite good called Arnhem: The Fight to Sustain. It talks about the Air Force ability to sustain those drop zones that you're talking about. So
absolutely. By the way, one of the trustees of the Royal Logistic Corps Museum, he died a few years ago, but a wonderful read as well. Yeah. By the way, if anybody wants to, following my failure to produce this, if Peter, you give me a link, I'll do a book list for you, and I can email it to you. So don't feel that I'm cheating you tonight.
Perfect. We'll I'll definitely, we can even add those into the RCLSA History and Heritage page on the website.
That's it. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, another question here, I'll just repeat it. Could we see in our modern time the equivalent of a shift in the allocation of resources turning to our benefit, like the rebuilding of railways did? So I guess, do you see some sort of big shift in logistics?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, when we went into former Yugoslavia, it was basically regarded as being a Royal Engineers theme park, big bridges and railways and all of that. Here in the UK, the British Army has done away as a regular trade with anything to do with railways. It's now a reserve forces trade. It has little prominence, and yet in the event of a future campaign, quite clearly, railways are going to be more efficient than roads. One of the big emphasis here in units capable of long distance travel is using forces that are entirely wheeled rather than tracked, because they can travel further and actually are more efficient. So I think the way to look at it will be to look at it in terms of, what is next. Now, just to go back on ourselves, in 1854, sorry, you're thinking, what's he talking about? The British Army landed in the Crimea. It landed completely without any effective horse transport, on the basis that the Treasury cut it in 1866 to save money, on the basis that in any future campaign we would simply hire horses, and we'd hire wagons, and we'd hire wagoners. Result of that was, you can work, what happens in the Crimea. So the British Army then said, well, why don't we get around this one? And the answer was railways. And we the Brits, we built the first ever military railway. The French laugh at us and continue to use horses until they all die because there's no forage. And then we build them a railway as well. It's worthwhile saying, by the way, that when that railway was built in 1855, the guys that built it, the contractors, said, we'll build it, but the army mustn't help us because they've never done it before. So one thing to say is that one problem is created by a treasury. Yeah. The solution is to use high tech, whatever's next. And I mean, from our point of view, where are we now? Are we talking about forward resupply using drones? Yeah. Or possibly, under right circumstances, and I know that you're experimenting it with as well as we are, actually, is it appropriate in certain conditions to think about using pack ponies or mules? But, that's something to think about. Bear in mind, I'm a historian, I'm not a fortune teller.
Perfect. I think, as we often say in the logistics, flexibility is the key. So we need to look at all of our options available.
Correct.
Another question just came up, so I'm going to read this as I go. I didn't get a chance to review it. You had mentioned Nazis became adept at repairing railways when the Allies had air superiority during the Normandy campaign. I'm concerned with logistical convoys in the modern warfare being vulnerable to indirect munitions and air-based threats. Are you aware of any adaptations that the Nazis made to the way they established their lines of communications with regards to vehicle-based convoys that could be theoretically applied today?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that the Nazis do, and certainly we become adept at dealing with this one, is the realization that actually virtually all tanks on the move have a trailer on them which contains fuel. So Allied pilots were told, don't go for the tank, you probably won't knock it out. Go for the trailer, because even if you don't knock it out, it will actually then run out of fuel. And looking at basically tanks lost in the Northwest campaign, Northwest Europe campaign of the Second World War, the majority of them are destroyed by their crews when they run out of fuel. If you ever go to look at that tank at Vermontier in the Falaise pocket, it was burned out by its crew. It ran out of fuel. There was enough fuel to burn it out. They burn it out. So you're going to bear that in mind. And I don't know what there would be. I mean, in the collection of the RCLSA Museum, we had a fuel tanker that was given a canvas cover to look like an ordinary truck, so that air attack wouldn't be able to identify it as being fuel and therefore vulnerable, and more importantly, key to the campaign, because it would look like an ordinary truck. Just out of interest, one of our previous au pairs, when we had an au pair, her father, who I met, was Serbian. I didn't like him very much, but he told me that for much of the campaign, the NATO campaign against Serbia, his job was providing, wait for it, greenhouse heaters. And I said, why? And he said, well, what we did is we made basically look-alike decoy tanks, but they only worked if they had a heat signature. So we put inside the back of them, under a sheet of corrugated iron, a greenhouse heater, because it would look like a real tank. So and he said, during the campaign, I lost one man, and that was the man that went back too early when the greenhouse heater had gone out and was still warm. And we must have used, I don't know, millions of pounds to kill a tank that turned out to be a greenhouse heater and a private soldier in the Serbian army. So yeah, again, I don't know what it would look like, but I suspect people are, you know, working on this now. I'd love to know, and I could write it up. Excellent.
One of the officers online actually just mentioned that during Afghanistan, because we had a shortage of FARs, that they mocked them up as cargo trucks as well, so the Taliban wouldn't think they would burst into flames with an RPG or something along those lines.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Perfect. There are some questions in the chat regarding a battlefield tour, and I think Andy's aware of it. We pushed. There's an Operation Faust one that was supposed to go 2 years ago, postponed due to COVID, and it's going in 2023. So I will answer those questions in a bit. I'm just going to stick with the questions. Okay, I think that is actually all the questions in the chat. Does anyone have any additional chat questions, or if they'd like to at this time unmute and ask a question, please do so, and I'll give that just a moment.
Well, I've seen a question on there. A battlefield tour or battlefield study looking at logistics would be super. We could do so well. Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah,
excellent. Well, yeah, I think we've got John Page is tracking that for next year, and we'll get some more information out to everybody. And I think we'll
lovely. Fine.
Ideally have anyways. We're working through that. Okay, well, if there's no questions, then Andy, I'd like to thank you for taking the time this evening. It was a fantastic presentation, and I think as we look at the situation in Europe today, there are a remarkable number of similarities, but logistics hasn't changed. We still need to get fuel, ammunition, food, you name it, to the fighting forces, and our logisticians here in Canada, whether they do it by sea, air, or land, still do that every day. So thank you very much. I'd now like to turn it back to John Page for any comments you have, John.
Thank you very much, Peter. Andrew, wonderful presentation. We really appreciate your time and effort. I certainly understood everything you were saying and why you were saying it, and we certainly do live in very interesting times. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Somebody was asking about books on the Second World War and Canadian support. I would recommend Arnold Warren's the Wait for the Wagon, which is it was produced in 1961 for the Diamond Jubilee of the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. It gives an excellent summation of both the First and Second World Wars. So I would certainly recommend that. It is available in the library, and many of us have copies. Operation Faust, which in 1945 was the delivery of humanitarian aid to the starving Dutch civilians behind Nazi German lines near the end of the war, in cooperation with the Germans, because I knew it was over. We have a battlefield tour that we were planning for the 75th anniversary in 2020. Thanks to COVID, it had been postponed until this year. And just recently, we've had to postpone it until next April, May. So anybody out there that is interested in coming and joining us, please contact me. My contact information is in the logistician, the birthday edition that was released today. So please contact me, and we can make that work in 2023. Thank you all. I'll ask the senior serving if he has anything to add, General.
Thanks, John. I just want to thank Andrew. Certainly, again, the passion for history and ensuring that we keep these lessons alive. And certainly, even just listening to what his stories on the Normandy campaign and so on, and how much that still resonates in some of the things even we live in modern times, and not losing those lessons, I think was one great takeaway. Again, thank you to you and the team. This has been a fantastic presentation, and I'm glad to see we had such a great turnout. And again, Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Peter, do you have anything to add?